All right, this is Game Time Episode 3, Muskets and Tomahawks, Part 2. And in Part 2 here, we're going to go through how to play Muskets and Tomahawks. So the first thing up is to talk about the troops that are involved. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, this really covers the French and Indian War and the American War of Independence and a lot of the other little small skirmishes in North America during the 18th century. But what I have here is the French and Indian War. I have a French and Indian force facing off against a British force over here. And let's take a quick look at just some of the units that are involved here. So first is I have a unit of French Marines over here, and they're a Compagnie Française de la Marine. And so they're in a regular troop type, however, they're regular morale, and we'll talk about characteristics here in a second. So French Marines, we have some Canadian militia crossing the ford here. There's 6 Indians that are in the woods here, and then there's 2 units of regulars at 10 each, and then the French regular officer. On the British side here, I have a unit of Rangers coming through the field here, a second unit of American Rangers that are occupying this wood, and then a unit of British regulars here at the wall, and a unit of British Grenadiers that are elite just back here off the wall, just off the road. And then, of course, a British officer, so each side has an officer. A little bit about characteristics. So generally speaking, the characteristics cover movement, so your movement value. You have your shooting value, so the number that you'll need on a D6 to beat or match in order to score hits. So generally speaking, let's say, for example, the Canadian militia here, their shooting characteristics is a 4+, so they need a 4+ on a D6 without modifiers to hit in shooting. There's 2 melee-related characteristics. That's aggressiveness and defense. Aggressiveness is used when you're determining how many hits you do on your opponent, and then defense is essentially your saving roll once your opponent hits you in melee. And so we're going to use these characteristics throughout the game here. And then, of course, there's a troop type and then a morale type. And, of course, they can be different. In a lot of cases, they're the same. So, for example, regulars here are troop type regular and a morale regular. What you have over here with the Canadian militia is a troop type that is irregular and a morale type that is irregular. And then something that's a bit of a hybrid between the two is the French Marines here, which are a troop type of irregular and a morale of regular. And something special about the French Marines here is that actually they have this special trait called light troops. So you can actually field them as just another regular unit here, or you can choose to field them as irregulars and kind of in the skirmish formation a little bit more light. And so that's kind of an example of some of the characteristics you'll see us use throughout the game here. A little bit about formations. Generally, everything functions in a skirmish type formation here, and every unit has a unit leader. And so, for example, in the Canadian militia here, this is the unit leader. All the models within the unit need to stay within a single move distance of the unit leader. And of course, because movement differences vary, that'll be a variable distance. So, for example, with the Canadian militia, his move is 6 inches, so everybody in his unit has to stay within 6 inches of him. The French Marines move 5 inches, the regulars move 4 inches. Generally speaking, for our own terms, so we can kind of put the leader anywhere for the unit. If you're in base-to-base contact in a firing line, we don't really care where the unit leader is. We just say that they can all kind of form the firing line and be happy. And so that's a little bit about formations. This is a firing line. These are skirmishes. A firing line is really the only other kind of trait, and this is a special thing generally for regulars that they can do. And it gives them a benefit in shooting and the ability to do a bayonet charge, which is a melee-related thing, which we'll talk about when we get to the melee example. Really quick about officers. These are, of course, your special guys. They're always a unit of 1. Normal units of 1 take morale disadvantages, and morale in this game is called a reaction test. So whenever you have to take a reaction test, you're essentially testing morale. The good thing about officers is really there's 3 things to know. The first is that they deliver a +1 to reaction tests, again, those morale tests, to any unit of the same troop type that is within 6 inches of them. So because he's a regular officer, he can deliver a +1 to reaction test for these 2 regular units. Of course, you can have more officers in your list than just 1. There's rules that tell you how to put your army list together that we're not going to cover here. When it comes to targeting officers, you might say, hey, he's on his own, he's a guy by himself, wouldn't it be pretty easy to shoot him? Well, there's really 2 things to understand there. First of all is that he can only be targeted if he's the closest unit of his troop type. So if there's a closer unit of his troop type that you can shoot at, you have to shoot at them first. The second thing is that even if you do shoot him and manage to score a kill on him, he can hand that kill off to any friendly model, not just of his troop type, that is within 2 inches of him. So it makes officers very resilient in the game, and you're not going to be afraid to get them in the into the fray and doing some melees and helping out their troops. And so they're not just out there to die, for example. They do have an actual function in the game. All right, so that's a little bit about the troops that are on the table. Let's talk about the activation deck. So your basic turn is 1 round through a deck. And of course, there's multiple cards in the deck here, but once you've gone through every card in the deck, that consists a game turn. The kinds of cards that are in this deck vary a little bit. So first of all, there's a type of card called activation cards. And activation cards are specific to troop types. So for example, if I pull these up here, kind of the anatomy of an activation card here is you have the troop type that it applies to, so regulars. You have the nationality it represents, which in this case, this is a British card. This is an American/French card, depending on which force you're playing. We're using it for the French. And then you have the number of actions this card is delivering for this particular activation. So if I was to flip up this card here, I would put it down and say, hey, all of my regular units of troop type regular get 2 actions before this card is resolved. And of course, whoever's turn it is, in this case the British player, can decide which order to resolve those which order to resolve those actions against his various units. And of course, you can also divide it up. So this unit could take 1 action. You could go over to the British Grenadiers, resolve their 2 actions, and then go back and resolve this unit's second action. The only stipulation is that within the context of a single action, you have to go through to completion on that single action before you can move on to the next one, be it the same or a different unit. And so here's an example of some regulars. You're going to add additional cards in based on the troop types that make up your army here. So for example, we have some irregulars. So the Rangers over here on the British side, the militia and the Marines over here on the French side are all irregulars. And the key here is that essentially most units get 4 actions per turn. The regulars are going to get their 4 actions on 2 cards of 2 actions each. Irregulars and Indians, for example, are going to get their 4 actions on 4 separate cards that give them 1 action each. So it's a little less predictable as to when their actions are going to come up during the turn. And here's an example of an Indian card, for example. So anything of troop type Indians would get their action, and this is the French one. And of course, the deck, when it comes with the game, gives you all the various options that you can do. So these are generally referred to as activation cards because they're specific to a troop type. Another unique kind of card is called a forward boys card. If your list or your army has an officer in it, then this card is in your deck. And of course, if your officer is killed, then you would remove the card from the deck. I should add that also if you have any elite troops on your side, you should add this card to your deck. Because what it does is any unit that's elite or that is an officer gets an action, a single action, when this card comes up. So let's take the British side, for example. We have some British Grenadiers here, which are elite, and we have the British officer here. If the British forward boys came up, that means that they both get a single action each. What's special about the officer in this case is he can actually take that forward boy's action and pass it off to a unit within 6 inches. So he'll forego taking the action himself in favor of a friendly unit of the same troop type within 6 inches taking that. It's important to note that no matter what, a unit cannot take more than 1 action on a forward boys card. So for example, the British officer couldn't give the Grenadiers his action to give them 2 actions because they're elite and they get 1 natively. He would have to give it to, say, this unit over here, which doesn't get 1 since they're just regulars and not elite. So he could pass his action over here, and then the Grenadiers could take their action on a forward boys card. So that's forward boys. There's, of course, special event cards numbered 1, 2, and 3. Generally, for me, I include 1 event per turn. And so when this comes up, you would roll on a 1 through 6 chart and determine what the random event is for that turn. Lastly is when you have taken at least half of your models as casualties, be it from melee or shooting, whatever it might be, at the end of that turn, that is when you exhaust the deck, you're going to add that side's morale card into the deck. And when the morale card is drawn on the next turn, every unit on that side, again, showing the nationality here, every unit on that side is going to need to take a reaction test. And of course, there's some modifiers that go along with that to make it not so great. So essentially reflecting the fact that your side is losing and your troops are starting to break from the field. And so really, those are the kinds of cards you're going to see in the activation deck here. And of course, as we play through the game or the examples here, these are all the cards that could potentially come up. All right, so when a card delivers an action to a unit, what are the actions you can take? And of course, there's 3 actions. There's move, shoot, or reload. Movement should be pretty straightforward. You get to move your troops up to their movement characteristic, taking terrain penalties and so forth. Shooting, of course, you can go and declare a target that's valid and go shoot your guys at it, and then reload. And what reload is when you do shoot, your unit's going to take a black powder marker. And generally I use little smoke puffs, so if it's individuals that are shooting, I use these little cotton balls to just mark the individuals who have shot. If it's a volley from a unit, I use these handy firepower lights from Warlord Games, and you can stick those out there. And of course, the great thing about these is that they light up if you press the little button here. And of course, they have the setting for volley fire and independent fire. So if you want to really make it kind of look cool on your board, you can do that. So when they shoot, they would take these black powder markers, and then in the next action, they could then reload. And when they reload, of course, you just remove these from the table, and those guys are reloaded. It's very important to note that everything is done from an individual model's perspective here. When it comes to moving, it's not like some other systems where you move the unit leader and then everybody kind of falls in around him. Every model moves and suffers terrain on an individual basis. So if this unit moved through rough terrain, that's not how it works. It's these 5 guys could move over here and be fine. If these 3 guys had to go over an obstacle, then they would have to pay that obstacle penalty. So everything's determined on a model-by-model basis, be it shooting, movement, line of sight, whatever it might be. All right, so let's take a closer look at movement. And so when it comes to movement, the first thing to understand, like any system, is terrain. And so, of course, every unit has its own movement value. It's important to note that your movement value can never be reduced below a single inch, so 1 inch, no matter what the modifiers. Essentially what you see here is woods are considered difficult terrain. You have obstacles like walls. Very difficult could be like fording rivers if you don't have a ford to do here. If you're just going straight across it, it could be impassable. But essentially, difficult terrain is going to reduce your movement by 2 inches. Likewise, for obstacles that are less than or equal to the height of a man, quote unquote, will be 2 inches. And then you have very difficult terrain, which you would suffer a -3 inch penalty for going over. And then, of course, impassable, you just can't go through. Entering a building through a door or a window or exiting costs 2 inches. So that's a little bit about buildings. And, of course, buildings in this game have their own section in the rules to deal with those. But that's generally the kinds of terrain you're going to see. Most commonly will be obstacles and difficult terrain like woods. A great trait to have on your troops, and what really makes irregular troops dominate this game a little bit, is the fact that most of them have this trait called scouts. So scouts, which in this case are the American Rangers here, the French Marines, because they've been taken as light troops, the Canadian Militia, and the Indians here, means that they don't suffer movement penalties for going through difficult terrain or over obstacles that are less than the height of a man. They treat very difficult terrain as just difficult terrain. So that's some great things about the scout trait. And that's really why you don't want your regulars stuck in any kind of terrain, because first of all, they lose the firing line ability while they're in difficult terrain, and they're going to slow down significantly when they get into terrain. So something to keep in mind when you're thinking about force selection. So let's take a quick example of some movement for the British here. So let's say a card came up and it gave the British Grenadiers here a move action. Their movement value is 4, and so they could just move right up to the wall here. And of course, you just measure on an individual model basis. Now, because this is a firing line, we're just going to move them all up here, and it's nice and easy. From a firing line perspective, it's important to note that your line of sight for shooting is at the 45s here. So we're going to talk about shooting here next. But that's an example of a move there. It's pretty straightforward. You might want to build some movement trays for your troops. Generally speaking, you see a lot of like skirmish movement trays for these. I generally wouldn't use those for this game because it is very much a skirmish game and it matters where models are, and you don't always want them in the same position. Some of the regulars, because of the firing line trait, go for it. Use some movement trays. I've been working on some for a while. I just haven't got them all done. But for the irregulars or anybody not fighting in firing line, I wouldn't recommend using a movement tray. Okay, so let's move on to shooting. Now, shooting, the first thing you want to do is make sure you've spotted a unit. And spotting is kind of its own separate section in this game. I'm covering it as a part of shooting, but it also has relevance when you look at hidden movement, which is an option to the rules that you don't have to use. But any unit with scouts can use this hidden movement capability. Not going to cover it right now. If you get the rules, you can go read all about it. So let's talk about spotting here briefly. All right, so spotting is just making sure you can see the target. Now, because things are so terrain heavy, you may not always be able to see it. What's good is that there's a quick reference sheet at the back of the book here for Muskets and Tomahawks. It gives you the spotting table here. And quite honestly, it hasn't really been a challenge in our games because your base spotting for any troops that are in the open, as you can see them at 96 inches. Light cover, which is what we treat most of our cover as here, like the hedgerows here, is 36 inches. And then anybody that's in a dense cover, like a dense woods here, would be seen at 18 inches. If they fired their weapons and they have black powder markers, then it's a +2. And what that means is that wherever you're at on these columns, it would go 2 to the right and make it easier to spot. You always start on this dark column here and then adjust from there. If it's natives, so Indians or regulars, then they automatically get a -1 to this, so it makes them harder to see. And so that's kind of your spotting thing here. So the first thing you would check is to see if you've actually spotted the unit. The next thing to talk about is facing and line of sight. So facing is pretty straightforward. The models can see 180 degrees to their front. And so just because they're skirmishers doesn't give them 360 degrees visibility. I've based my guys on round bases. I like it aesthetically, and generally speaking, we can figure out what the front of the figure is. We don't get too wrapped around the axle. If this unit, which is clearly going this way, wanted to shoot the opposite direction, they would have to pivot and then suffer a minus to their shooting because they had to pivot to shoot. Firing lines are a little bit more strict. You may want to have a little arc of visibility handy because they do shoot out at the 45s for the unit, and so they do have a very strict line of sight. When it comes to shooting through models, you can't draw a line of sight even through friendly models that are in skirmish order. So for example, let me grab a couple of these Marines. If they were in front of the Canadian militia here and I wanted to shoot through here, I can't even shoot through the gaps. So this unit, wherever it's occupying, would completely block it. The only way you can shoot through friendly models is if you are in base-to-base contact with them. That goes for skirmishers as well. So obviously the firing line here, if it's in 2 ranks, can fire through itself. You could be in a single rank and still be in a firing line. There's nothing that says you have to be in 2 ranks. If I wanted him to fire through this guy in the front here, I want them to be in base-to-base contact. A lot of this will come into play when you get into terrain here. You know, we allow a little bit of fudging because, for example, my trees don't come off here and there's rocks that are inside of there. So we try to get them as close as possible and let them shoot. But if you just throw your guys in the big woods here, that doesn't mean that everybody can just treat this as a big unit that's shooting in all directions. You have to be in base-to-base contact in order to draw a line of fire or line of sight through a friendly model. And of course, pretty much all the other stuff would apply, like drawing a line of sight through terrain and through enemy models. Obstacles of less than man height do not block line of sight, so you can see over this wall, for example. So this unit can see them coming down the road, and you don't get the benefit of the stone wall unless you're actually at the stone wall. So that's facing and line of sight. A little bit about weapons. The good news is that there's really one primary weapon for the whole period, and that is the musket. Even for the natives by this time, most of them had dropped bows and everything else in favor of muskets because they've been trading with the French for a long time. So a musket is essentially a 24-inch range. Any shooting over 12 inches, regardless of whether that's with a rifle or a musket, is going to suffer a -1 to its shooting. And so the range is half range or long range isn't determined by each particular weapon. Long range in this game is essentially anything over 12 inches. Point blank range is anything that's 4 inches or less. I've cut out a couple of these handy little markers here. This is just on a map board, and I just measured out to 12 inches so I can kind of quickly determine if something's point blank or if something's within 12 inches. So there's a range on a weapon. The second characteristics of a weapon is firepower. And that's going to be used when we determine if something's been killed after it's been hit, and I'm going to cover that here in a second. But every weapon comes along with a firepower. And then lastly, you could have some special rules. So for example, muskets have a special rule that they are black powder weapons. black powder weapons actually suffer a minus to their firepower, which is determined to kill models at long range. So anything over 12 inches, they would actually be less effective. So let's go through an example of shooting here. So the first thing is that we would measure range. So let's say we want to fire this French regular unit at the British Grenadiers here. So the first thing we're going to do is clearly they can see them. They're going to get the benefit of the obstacle, but we're going to check the range here. I could just check everybody's definitely within 12 and definitely over 4 inches, so it's not a point blank shot. And so the first thing I want to do is pick up my 12 dice and get ready here. So I'll go grab the blue dice for the French. And now that everybody can see, and of course the back rank is in base-to-base contact with the front rank, and they're all in a fire line so they can shoot. The next thing I want to do is determine any shooting modifiers. And so because they're behind the wall, that's going to make it heavy cover. And heavy cover in this game delivers a -2 to hit, and it also decreases the effectiveness of your firepower. Again, we're getting to that in a second. So the first thing we're going to do is roll to hit, and I'm at a -2, and of course there's other modifiers, but that's the only one for this particular shot. The shooting characteristic for regulars is a 5+. They do get a +1 to hit because they're in a firing line formation, so essentially it makes it a 4+ base, and then it's going to be -2 because they're in the target's in heavy cover, which goes 4 to 5, 5 to 6. So they need 6s to hit. So I'm going to pick up these dice here and see how many hit. Excellent. I got 2 hits from shooting. And then the next thing to determine would be to see how many guys you actually have killed. And so the firepower for a musket is 3+. Because these guys are behind at heavy cover, it's actually going to go to a 4+. So I simply just roll these 2 dice, looking for a 4+. I get 1 kill as a result. Once you've killed something, it's dead. That's the end of it. There's no saves or anything like that. There are some saves in melee, but not from shooting. So I would remove him from the table. He's dead. Any unit that suffers any casualties from shooting has to take a reaction test. And like I mentioned earlier, a reaction test is essentially a morale test. And that's really the last step of shooting here. And so immediately it would take it, if it got shot again in the very next action or activation that occurs, it takes another morale test. So every time you take casualties, even within the same turn, you would take a reaction test as a result. So let's take a look at a reaction test. What are the possible results? So the first result is that you could be okay, no effect. The second one is that you could recoil, and if a unit recoils, it will take 1 move directly away from the enemy that caused the test and stop facing that enemy. So in this case, these guys would back up 4 inches and stay facing the unit that shot them. They can continue to take actions for the rest of the turn. When their cards come up, that's the end of it for that recoil. The second result is flight, and a flight is very similar to recoil from a movement perspective. You're going to back up your full move from the unit that caused it, but you're going to go in the direction of your movement. So they're actually going to be facing away from the enemy, and then they're going to get one of these handy little flight markers. So there's very few markers you need for this game outside of the black powder markers, which you can use cotton balls for, which kind of look thematic. But I've got these little round bases I use for flight, and it says flight on here. If you mark a unit flight, they move 4 inches away, they're facing away from the enemy, and for the rest of this turn, until the turn is complete, that is, you've exhausted all the cards in the deck, they can no longer take actions for the rest of this turn. They're stuck there until the turn is over. At the end of the turn, you would pick up all the flights because they automatically recover, and then in the next turn, they would get to take actions like normal. So that's a flight. And then the last result you could get, generally if it's a 0 or less on a D6, so you need to have some sort of modifiers on there, then you would rout. And any unit that routs is immediately just picked up off the table and destroyed. So in the case of regulars here, generally they want a 4+ to be okay. On a 2 or a 3, they would have a recoil. On a 1, they would flight. And on a 0 or less, they would be destroyed. Or rout, which is what it's called in the actual rules. So that's an example of reaction. We shot here. So let's take a look at how to take that test. So the British Grenadiers here are elite. The elite lets them re-roll the reaction test if they roll a natural 1 on the dice. So that's a special thing, but let's just look at it straight up here. There's, of course, some modifiers. But British Grenadiers here, they're forming a firing line, which gives them a +1. There's at least 6 models in the unit, which gives them a +2. And their officer is within 6 inches, which gives them a +3. they've been shot by a unit that is in firing line, which is a -1. So that makes them a net +2. And so again, I'm looking for a 4+ to be safe. I'm going to roll the dice here. I get a 5 + 2 is a 7. And they're perfectly fine because anything higher than a 4 is great. So that's an example of shooting. And of course, the last thing to always remember is when you shoot, you need to mark the shooting unit as having fired. So we would put down the smoke here to indicate that they need to reload before they're going to be able to shoot again. There's nothing that says that your very next action has to be a reload. They could go charge in or move somewhere. They would just take the firepower marker, or the black powder marker with them, and to indicate that they haven't reloaded yet. All right, now that we've seen a shooting example, let's move on to melee. So the first thing to understand is, how do I engage in melee? Generally speaking, when you move, you cannot get within 1 inch of an enemy model. Melee is the only time in which you can engage closer than a single inch to an enemy model. So I've got some Indians here in the woods, and I'm going to quickly check their movement range, and their movement range is 6. So we'll say an action comes up. The Indians here want to engage this British regular unit behind the stone wall in melee. Not a very smart move, but hey, this is an example. So I'm going to quickly check. Everybody is within 6 inches. So they can all make it to contact. Whenever you move into contact, it's important to understand you can move within 1 inch of an enemy unit. You need to maximize all the models on both sides that are involved. So that's not only enemy models, but your models as much as you can. And you have to take the most direct route possible to hit the target. You can go up to 4-on-1 in terms of how many models you can stack up. You're just going to roll all the dice together anyways, but it's important to note that if you're trying to determine how many of your people can actually contact, if you can physically contact the base 4 times, you can get up to 4 people involved. A special thing, and one thing I really love about Muskets and Tomahawks here, is the ability to tomahawk people or use thrown weapons. And of course, you can use these for regular shooting if you just want to throw the weapons and run away or something. But one of the great things with melee here is thrown weapons allow you to throw the weapon and then engage in melee as a single action. And so that's exactly what these Indians are going to do. And it's just a regular shooting shot with the one note that any casualties that are inflicted as a result of these thrown weapons don't cause a reaction test. This is really the only time a reaction test isn't triggered by shooting or casualties. And so let's start off with that. I've got 6 guys. They don't suffer a long-range penalty here. It's just 6 inches. So I've got 6 guys at 6 inches. Their shooting characteristic is a 4+ for Indians. And they're still going to suffer the fact that there's a stone wall here. And so the heavy cover bonus here is going to make that 4 go to a 6 because it's -2. And it's also going to lower the firepower, which we'll get to here in a second. So 6 dice looking for 6s. Wow, I get 3 6s. That's pretty impressive. And so 3 hits. The firepower on a thrown weapon is a 4+. It's going to go to a 5+ because of the stone wall and the heavy cover. So I'm going to roll again to see how many I kill. So I have 3 hits, but I only do 1 actual kill. He gets removed, and that's the end of it. So again, it does not trigger a reaction test. It's important to note that thrown weapons are a one-use weapon. I would need to somehow mark the fact that the Indians have already used their thrown weapons for the game. I would recommend doing it off to the side or just try to remember it. It's generally not a big deal. All right, so the next thing to do would be to move everybody into contact. And of course, I can pretty much contact everybody in the front rank. And because Indians are scouts, they can jump over the wall at no penalty. I can actually wrap around with this guy and even get him in. So I need to maximize the models. I'm going to bring them all in here. And again, you have to take the most direct route possible. But in the case of the Indians that were over here, the most direct route brought them over the wall. And so let's go roll. We'll roll them separately because the results will be a little bit different for those that are fighting over the wall versus those that jumped over to engage these guys. And so let's take a look here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 really men involved because again I'd have to maximize models, so really he's there and I get these 3 guys in. So 6 regulars on 6 Indians. 2 of them are over the wall, so 4 of them we're going to roll separately here. So the first thing you do is you look at your aggressiveness, and aggressiveness for Indians is a 3+. So they're just going to take a straight up 4 guys. We'll start here looking for 3+. Great, they got 3 hits as a result of that. I'll roll the 2 guys here on the side separately because they're going to modify things a little bit differently here. And so they're looking for 3s as well. They both hit as well. Everything is simultaneous, so you don't remove casualties and then fight back with who survived. So all 6 of the British are going to fight back. And of course, because the Indians charged in, they're not going to get any benefit from the stone wall here. So I'm just going to roll 6 dice straight up. And the aggressiveness of British regulars is a 4+. So they're going to look for 4s. And I'm going to grab the red dice here and not roll the blue dice. So 6 guys looking for 4s. And they get a pathetic 2 hits on the Indians. So 2 hits from the British on the Indians. Now here's where the stone wall comes into effect. So now that we've determined how many times everybody have been hit, we're going to use our defense to determine how many guys get saved. And so because the Indians here did 3 hits over the stone wall, the normal 4+ defense for the regulars goes to a 3+ defense. So they get a benefit from the wall. So I'm going to roll this to see how many guys get saved. Awesome. The British have saved all 3 of the guys that took hits over the wall. They're going to roll the 2 on the side here, but without the benefit of the wall, they're going to be looking for 4+. So I roll that. I save 1 guy. 1 guy gets killed from the side here. I'm just going to remove him really quick here. And then the Indians owe me 2 saves or defense rolls, which is a 4+ for them. And I roll that, and they both save. So both Indians have saved. At this point, we would check and see who won the combat. Now, let's say, for example, really quick, I had killed 1 Indian. If it's a tie, you immediately fight another round of melee. And you keep fighting rounds of melee until this action is resolved by one side or the other, recoiling or flighting or being completely destroyed in the combat. You'll keep going until that's resolved. In this particular case, the Indians have won because they did 1 casualty and the British failed to do any on the Indians. So at this point, the British would owe a reaction test. Now, they are in a firing line. They have 6 or more models and their officers right there. So they're already a +3. There's really no negatives related to this combat right now. And so they're going to roll 1 dice looking for a 4 or better. I rolled a 1, but it's +3, which make it a 4+, so they're actually okay. So it was impossible for them to fail that. And because they've passed and they're still engaged, we would immediately fight another round of melee. So again, you keep fighting as long as both combatants stay in the melee. And you resolve it in this turn on this action right now. Once that's resolved, let's say in the next one, the Indians have the recoil back here. At that point, the melee would be over and you would go to the next action. I mentioned bayonet charge as a benefit of firing line earlier. The benefit of a bayonet charge is that provided you don't cross any obstacles or go through terrain, you get the benefit of a bayonet charge. And all that does is mean that normally you wouldn't have to take a reaction test until the end of melee. The target of a bayonet charge needs to take an immediate reaction test before the models are engaged. And so that's a bayonet charge. That's a benefit of charging when you're in a firing line. Excellent. So that's an example of melee. That's pretty much the meat and bones of this whole game. The only thing I'll add on top of that is when you determine your objectives for the game, each side rolls their scenario separately, which means, generally speaking, the majority of the time, both sides are going to have different objectives. Another thing that's really great, but it's an optional role, so you don't have to use it, and you might not want to use it for your first game, is the thing called subplots. And a side plot or a subplot is a really great thing that I think is unique to Muskets and Tomahawks. And side plots really add a lot of flavor into the game as well. So essentially a side plot, you pick one of your officers on your side. And so in this case, there's only 1 per side. So each of these officers would get 1. You roll on a 1-1 through 6-6 table, and you'll get a side plot that you need to either attain or you'll fail during the game, which is separate from your scenario objective. What's great about it is it actually does affect the outcome of the game. Let's say that the British, we had played this all out and the British had won and the British had lost. Or sorry, the British had won and the French had lost. And at the same time, the French had met their side plot and the British had not. That would actually make the British victory a draw. And so they do have an outcome, and they do, like I said, add a lot of flavor into it. But, you know, buy the rules and check it out for yourself. There's a lot of really great stuff that's in here. But that's the meat and bones of it. Let's move on to Roy and I throwing down in our 400-point game, and you can see everything from front to back and all the rules being put into play as we go through it.